Good morning, everybody. Today's session is focused on the topic of remote working, a very contemporary topic. It's on everybody's lips, has been for a few years. We will be addressing this topic holistically. Sometimes it's a topic that is addressed maybe through one lens, the technology lens, or the working culture lens, or what sort of demographics it appeals most to lens. There's a lot to it. Given that there's a lot to it, we have decided to work three different companies coming at it from different perspectives today: Russell-Cooke, Sayer Vincent, and Adapta. And I hope you'll enjoy today's session and get a lot out of it. I will, in turn, introduce each of our esteemed panelists today. And in turn, I will start with Carla from Russell-Cooke. Good morning, Carla.
Morning, Keith. It's great to be here. I'm Carla, partner in the charity and social business team at Russell-Cooke. So as a team, we sort of do basically anything that charities might want from a legal, governance, compliance perspective. I personally specialise in employment law for charities and data protection as well, but today firmly kind of wearing my employment hat.
Thank you, Carla. Great to have you with us. Good morning, Ross.
Morning, Keith. Hi, I'm Ross Palmer. I'm a senior tax manager at Sayer Vincent. Sayer Vincent is a firm of auditors and advisors, and we only work with charities and social purpose organisations, and so very much specialising in that particular area.
Yeah, great to have you with us as well, Ross. Paul, hello there.
Hello. And I'm Paul, one of the partners in Adapta. Surprise, surprise. We also work extensively in the not-for-profit sector with charities and membership organisations and other types of not-for-profits, helping them with their full spectrum of technology challenges. So whether it's system selection or preparing for a digital strategy or implementing a transformation programme, that's where we come at it from.
Tremendous. Thank you, Paul. We reached out in advance of this session to people we know across the sector to try and get their thoughts on what the burning issues were from their perspective as far as this topic of remote working was concerned. I think we've got a number of questions that I'm going to field to the panel today, hopefully get into a very good, reasonably high-level conversation about these topics. And the first question was actually around, it wasn't, it was about the conflation of remote working and flexible working. They're not the same. They can be quite different. Carla, your thoughts on this particular topic of remote working and flexible working? What is that distinction?
Yeah, I mean, from a legal point of view, it's really quite important that employers make that distinction at the outset, because flexible working is a statutory beast. There are minimum timescales that you have to consider a formal flexible working request in. There are only certain statutory grounds on which you can refuse a request, and a few other kind of legal requirements you have to comply with if someone's making a formal flexible working request. And importantly, if you agree to that, then their contract will change permanently to incorporate the flexible working arrangement that you've agreed with them. Typically, when we're talking more about remote working, hybrid working, that sort of thing, we're talking about a much more fluid arrangement, often non-contractual policies, a kind of approach that an employer has decided to take, but it might change over time, and therefore the kind of it's more of a kind of cultural organisation-wide approach to how you would do this, rather than an individual employee circumstances case by case kind of approach. So I think the very first thing all employers need to be clear about is, are we dealing with something that is a kind of non-contractual, hybrid, flexible working type thing, or are we dealing with something that's actually an individual making a flexible working request under the legal framework?
Okay. Sounds like there's a lot to unpack there. Ross, from a tax perspective, is there much difference? What do we need to watch out for in terms of gotchas?
Yeah, so from a tax purpose, we're not too worried about the exact framework of remote or flexible. What we're worried about is whether or not the employee's office or place of work is classified as what's called a permanent workplace. And it's that permanent workplace definition that drives the tax impact. And then the tax impact is what then feeds into things like expenses. Because as part of remote working and flexible working arrangements, a lot of people have been looking at what they do now in terms of expenses and potentially paying expenses for when people come into the office. And so you need to understand that permanent workplace definition in order to know whether or not, if you are paying those expenses, if they're taxable. So yeah, it's about, is it permanent? You would have to pay tax, or is it temporary, in which case travel expenses are okay? And getting into the nuances of whether or not something counts as permanent or temporary is a little bit beyond this session, unfortunately.
And that's the difference. Those expenses are different if they're related to the actual workplace or going to a different client's location, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So I think if you're going to a client, it's very likely to be temporary. You're only there for a temporary purpose. It's more around situations where people are going into the office occasionally, perhaps, particularly if you have remote working, where actually you're going into the office on some kind of regular basis. And people think that because, oh, you know, my place of work is home, for example, that means that they can pay expenses for when they go into the office. And that's not necessarily the case. It could still be classed as a permanent workplace for tax purposes.
Okay. Wow. Technology aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paul,
So
I think we've seen technology really drive a lot of these changes and make a lot of these changes possible over the last few years. Maybe in a way that the acceleration of this trend. From a technology perspective, I suppose what's your take on it all?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the technology has come on leaps and bounds. Ubiquitous connectivity, portable devices, systems and data being held in the cloud and being very accessible from any location, subject to security controls, of course, has made a lot of this possible. So in terms of the technology, flexible working and remote working, I mean, of course, they are different things, you know, working in a place as opposed to sort of at different times, let's say. They are different things in that regard, but from the technology angle, it's perfectly possible to support both in the same way, really. The concept of martini working, as some might call it, you know, the sort of anywhere, any place, any time. I think most organisations should be looking to enable people to work that way in principle. It's from the point of the technology, it's all entirely possible. We'll come on to it in a bit, but obviously there's major implications in terms of infrastructure and support arrangements and data security and all those kinds of considerations. But of itself, flexible working, remote working, the technology doesn't really make a distinction between place, time, etc.
I think the data security thing is somewhat overlooked quite often. That would be quite interesting thing to come back to. There's been a lot in the news on this thing over the last few years, and we've all seen lots of different opinions and lots of different experiences. I suppose maybe to you first, Ross, is this next topic that was passed to us. Upsides that you're seeing to remote working, either personally or, you know, obviously with your work with Sayer Vincent and the clients you work with.
Yeah, so from a purely financial standpoint, there are potential cost savings both for the employer and the employee. So there can be a benefit to both parties as a result of this. The employer, obviously, potentially there's the ability to save on office costs if it can be either completely or partially dropped. And for the employee, the example of remote working, yes, they might be incurring more expenses working from home, but hopefully their sort of travel cost savings more than outweigh that. So I think from a sort of purely financial standpoint, that there is a potential cost saving benefit. There are some sides potential risks and drawbacks as well, which perhaps we'll get onto later.
Yeah, I've certainly seen some clients I've worked with make quite radical changes in their office space arrangements, and that has been both in terms of location and in terms of the size. So it's all very, very interesting. Paul, your thoughts on this particular, remote working, the upsides and the technology aspects of that?
Yeah, of course. So in terms of upsides, I think you can look at it from the employee's perspective and the employer's perspective, and very often you see sort of debate, differences of opinions about whether it's a good thing or not. I mean, the first thing I say is sort of from the technology perspective to think of it as working. Computer systems aren't particularly fussy about what the time is, and whether it's day or night when people are logging on, when they're doing their work. Or even to a degree from where they're doing the work. So from a pure technology perspective, and assuming it's managed well, then people can be empowered to work as they wish, obviously within the constraints of company policy. They don't necessarily have to go into the office or spend large amounts of time traveling unless they actively choose or are required to do so. Implemented in the right way, it can be motivational for staff. It can help with recruitment, provide employers with a broader pool of candidates for particular roles, not just limited to people who live near the office. And it can, with the right systems in place, foster a more dynamic and agile working environment. So from the employee's perspective, it's very empowering, and the benefits are very clear. Addressing the elephant in the room, as it were, there is often concern that people might be slacking off at home. That, of course, isn't actually a technology issue of itself. But one thing I would say is that there have been various studies on this, and I think one of them was Microsoft's Envision event in 2022, where they found that employees who work in a hybrid manner work on average 47 minutes longer per day than they used to. So I think actually, if anything, the possible risk here is that people are finding it more difficult to turn off. They're spending more time doing their work. They're sort of staying in front of the computer during the lunch hour, whereas they might have sort of gone out previously. Which has to be, have to keep an eye on that, of course. But in terms of the upsides, it's I'd argue a great thing. There are many upsides.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, we touched upon elements of the people and culture aspects in some of these conversations. Carla, any more thoughts on people and culture, HR, as well as I suppose the legal perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about the upsides to remote working, it's really, effectively, we hear anyway, it's about recruitment and then retention of staff. Everything we hear from HR contacts, from recruiters at charities, is that people are asking about remote working policies and approach to remote working almost invariably. Now, clearly, there are some roles where people can't work remotely, but obviously today we're concentrating on the majority of roles where people can, in theory, work remotely. So candidates for those sorts of roles, so typically kind of the more traditionally office-based jobs, will be asking about that. And we hear it can be a real decider. So particularly for charities who might not be able to offer perhaps the highest salaries, the biggest sort of bonus arrangements that candidates might get in for-profit commercial kind of environments, perhaps an approach to hybrid working, flexible working that is a little more kind of flexible is going to be the thing that allows them to attract good talent, and then likewise retaining that talent. If someone wants to move from London to Somerset and makes a flexible working request, and the charity just simply says we don't do that, then there's a really good chance they're going to find another charity these days who does, and that, you know, you might then risk losing really good and valued members of staff.
Risks. I suppose we touch upon the upside, and Paul, your thoughts on, I suppose, you know, the risks and possible drawbacks inherent, and you touched upon a little bit, but a bit of a conversation around data security, information security. I guess that's one of the things, but I'm sure there's more to it than that, though.
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier about, you know, in terms of the difference between remote working and flexible working, there aren't sort of necessarily, you know, the technology can support either. And the implications are, of course, that the organisation needs to have the right technology in place, as well as the right processes and controls. And there are, from that angle, some fairly substantial issues that need to be tackled by any organisation that's looking to implement, in particular, remote or hybrid working. As you say, one is that of cybersecurity and even data protection as a consequence of that. So organisations that have adapted quickly to enable their staff to work from home may not have necessarily configured equipment in the right way. They might not have rolled out encryption on their devices. They might have loose arrangements in place or be ambiguous about whether or not people can use their own equipment. So actually knowing where your data is and being confident that it's being held securely is super important. I think it's true as a general principle that you know, since lockdown, there has been a significant increase in the number of cybersecurity related issues that organisations have been experiencing, and I'd argue that's in no small part because the infrastructure, the computing environment that people are using has become more distributed, and arguably a lot of organisations haven't had the right controls in place. And that's just on the security side of things. I mean, briefly whizzing through some of the other kinds of considerations. You know, there can be issues with collaboration. To some extent, that's an organisational issue in the first place. You know, if people are working in silos, not talking effectively with team members, then probably it's a broader thing than just technology. But you know, people are sort of there on their own, working from home, and the collaboration tools that help them stay connected to the organisation aren't in place, then that can reinforce that kind of thing. IT support, particularly where people are doing things like using home Wi-Fi connections that might or might not be reliable. You know, if they've got printers that are jamming or things that require sort of physical support, that needs to be thought through. IT support as well in the context of hours of work. So if we're looking at the flexible working as opposed to remote working, you know, if somebody's suddenly deciding to work, you know, on a Sunday morning or late in the evening and they have a technical issue, how do they get the support that they need? There are things like, you know, I think a lot of organisations now just assume that a lot of IT systems are in the cloud and can be accessed remotely with relative ease. Increasingly, I think that's becoming a reasonable assumption. However, it's still not actually the case all the time. A lot of organisations still have old legacy database systems that might not work well over remote connections, and so on. That
is true. I mean, we encounter that on a regular basis. The assumption that all the tools are in the cloud and all that easy to use is an easy one to make, and it's not always the case.
So there's a lot to think about in terms of risk from a technology perspective.
Ross, and maybe we've started touching upon this conversation where I think with the first question, but I'm guessing there's a lot of implications here that need to be considered from a financial, but also very much from a tax perspective?
Yeah. So I guess just starting from the financial side, there are potential cost savings, but there can be short-term costs involved. So, if you, for example, are giving up an office, lease per termination, dilapidations payments, things like that can start coming in straight away. And so actually there might be a short-term cost for a potential long-term gain. There are other costs to consider as well. It's not just, you're dropping the office and saving. You do have to think about the other, paying for a space when you want to have a meeting together, potential expenses, costs that you do need to factor in as well. And sometimes that can create a bit of an imbalance as well. If you have some employees that are in the office and some that are remote, and you're paying expenses for the remote employees when they come in, and of course you've got your people who are in the office all the time who don't get their expenses paid. This can create a bit of a financial imbalance between the two, and something that organisations need to be aware of. Then there's the tax side. So this is very much a complex area. As I mentioned, the definition of a permanent workplace is complicated and it's very nuanced. And you are likely to have a situation where two people who might appear similar in terms of working patterns, they could have very different treatments depending on what they are coming in. If they're coming into an office, what they're coming in there to do, and why they're coming in to do it. The guidance around this has not really been updated for quite a long time. It's recognised that it does need an update. The Office for Tax Simplification actually issued a paper on this last year. So there is some hope that something might come out in the next few months that does make this simpler. But at the moment, yes, it is complicated. It does take a lot of time to do it. And if expenses are taxable, there's a lot of additional reporting requirements in terms of reporting to HMRC what you need to do. And there's the impact on the individual, depending on how you're paying those expenses and what you've agreed in advance. That tax, the tax that's due might not hit them this year. It might end up going into their tax code and coming out in a future year. And so, you then have to explain the impact to your staff of why their tax is changing and why it's being done in that way. So there's a lot of things to think about depending on what you do and how you implement it, and particularly around things like expenses.
So I had no idea there was an office for tax simplification.
There actually isn't an office for tax simplification anymore. This was their final report. They've actually been closed down.
Really? Sounds like they're desperately needed. We should open them up again. Carla, your thoughts on this, on the risks and your particular perspective on it?
Yeah, I mean, from a kind of employment law side of things, the focus, I think, in the last couple of years was predominantly on the positives. So for a long time, we were just hearing a lot of HR people and employment lawyers saying, this is broadly just great for employees. I think what we started to see more recently is the beginnings of some trends that people think might be connected to a more remote workforce. And that's things like staff feedback saying they don't feel as supported, they don't get great supervision, they're not getting training opportunities they used to get. And we think that a lot of that is to do with that kind of organic sort of learning that you would get by being in a sort of buzzing office environment with more senior and experienced people. And it's actually really difficult to replicate that in sort of formal training sessions where you block out a period of time to talk about a particular topic. What people are missing out on is the kind of overhearing things and getting involved in things by sort of osmosis almost. That's also kind of tracking through to a sort of increase, or at least anecdotally and in our experience with working with clients, an increase in kind of grievances and complaints about things that probably pre-COVID, when obviously a lot of people moved to fully remote working, would have probably just been kind of dealt with in discussions between members of staff or in a one-to-one meeting or maybe even an appraisal, but wouldn't have become a kind of formal written complaint. And things are becoming a lot more sort of formalized. And it's possible, and some people have suggested, and I think they might be right, that is partly to do with a sort of reduction in the amount of kind of personal relationships that you build with your colleagues, and maybe that means a reluctance to just have a chat about a difficult subject, or a feeling that something is being done to you by a faceless management because you don't actually know the person who's written the email or something. So I think just those sorts of challenges, particularly if you're fully remote or predominantly remote and not in the office together very much, those challenges in making the kind of personal relationships and in allowing people to kind of have that training and development that they would have got organically in the office. I think those are the sort of main downsides or risks that we're seeing, as I say, at a relatively early stage at the moment.
I'm going to go back to you with the next question, actually, Carla, and I'm picking up on the people and culture theme and taking remote onto a whole new level. Well, let's imagine I decide to leave my lovely home in St Albans and go to Portugal.
Why would you do that?
Why would I do that? Why would I do that? But the remote working in extremis is people do occasionally do it. I have had meetings with people based abroad. The whole actually wanting to work in a location outside the UK as part of that kind of arrangement. Sort of special considerations of organisations really have on their radar when confronted with that kind of challenge?
This is a query that we've seen arising really only in the last 18 months, I suppose, where charities have been saying, actually, we've got maybe employees who want to work from a variety of different locations. So this is different to the old days when it might be, oh, we're thinking about opening an office in France or Brussels or something. This is about, we've got one employee in Spain, one employee in the US, one employee, etc. And I think because the technology makes it seem simple, people are a bit shocked when we have to tell them that legally, from an employment law perspective, it can be really complicated because there may well be local employment laws in each of those jurisdictions, each of those countries, that will impact on you as the employer. And so there's really no shortcut to having to take legal advice in each of those countries to understand the employment laws, local regulations, etc., that might impact on the arrangement. That could be in relation to hours of work, minimum pay for overtime, all sorts of things that are really going to have an impact on not just how you pay and sort of terms that you have with that individual member of staff, but then how it impacts on everyone else in the organisation who might again feel that someone else is now getting paid more than them or something. And then just the legal costs in getting all of that advice is a burden for charities, and one that they really might not feel that they can justify as being the best use of charity funds. And it's not like you can really just take that advice once and put it in a drawer, because as we all know, employment laws change from time to time. So you're going to have to refresh that advice, maybe on an annual basis to make sure nothing has changed in that country. So quickly it becomes expensive in terms of legal costs, and administratively for the charity, quite a headache.
Wow. That was more than I was expecting, so I'll cancel that move. Then, Ross, from a tax perspective, I'm not expecting that you're going to communicate anything less complex to me, but tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're not wrong. It's funny actually what Carla was saying, how when some organizations are thinking that having one employee is different to having a branch, and if they were setting up like a branch overseas, they'd be approaching it in a very different way, when actually in fact the approach is very similar. So I guess, from a financial point of view, first things to potentially think about is you are potentially dealing with foreign exchange. Are you going to be paying them in the local currency of whatever country they've moved to, or are you still going to fix paying them in the UK, in pounds? If you stick with pounds, then you've got certainty for you, but depending on currency fluctuations, the risk sits with the employee. If you go with local currency, then the employee probably has more certainty, but then you've got risks on your side. Also, just paying a foreign account can be more complicated for some organisations. You've got to make sure that your bank account is even set up to do that. In terms of the tax side, yes, things are complicated. COVID made things a bit simpler. Most countries generally relax their rules during COVID, but we are now in a place where nearly all of those type of reliefs ended. Most of them ended around March last year, some sooner. And then we now have a situation where actually there is no universal rule in how countries approach tax. And even within the EU, you have different rules within different EU countries. So there's kind of like 3 different things you have to think about. So number 1, income tax. If the individual is now overseas, are they now resident in the UK? And it's whether or not you're resident in the UK that drives whether or not you have to deduct UK income tax. But that is something that the employee agrees with HMRC. As employer, you're not involved with that. You just do what you're told to do. In very general terms, if an individual is resident in a country for more than 183 days, so half a year or more, then they're resident in that country. But that is a very, very general rule. There's lots of nuance. It is possible to be deemed resident in more than one country, and then you're having to dive into like double taxation agreements to decide who gets to deduct the tax, essentially. So a lot of uncertainty for you as an employer, because if tax does have to be deducted, you might well be responsible for doing that. And sometimes you can even get local withholding taxes. So there's a lot of things going on. Then you talk about things like national insurance and social security, and the rules aren't the same. So different set of rules that apply. You might have to start deducting NI even if they're resident in the UK for income tax purposes. Now, the UK does have agreements with some countries, which does include the EU. So for those countries, it is slightly simpler. But if they're not on that list, then things get very complicated very quickly. And then finally, there are corporate taxes. There are certain countries in the world where having one employee there at a high enough level could mean that you're deemed to have an establishment there. And then suddenly you're caught by local corporate taxes. So everything requires advice on a local level. And as I said, there's different rules within the EU, so you need it country by country. You cannot assume that France has the same rules as Spain, because they don't.
Thank you, Ross. Paul, I'm guessing data and data protection might be a theme here, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's what I'd say would be the main consideration. Again, from pure technology perspective, the world is a very connected place. There of course can be significant considerations there, but I'd say the one to really look into would be that of data protection compliance, thinking about where data is being stored and processed, making sure that that's being done lawfully, and so on. But in terms of the technology itself, actually, the technology can support it wherever it's being done. As I say, the issue is perhaps more of a legal and compliance one in that regard. Yeah.
The technology enables everything. So people think it's simpler. To be fair, it's not. One last round of questions, probably to Carla in the first instance, and that is, we've talked about a lot of interesting challenges and opportunities here, a lot of perspectives on the remote working challenge. I suppose from a practical perspective, Carla, what do you think organisations should be considering to make sure they go about remote working in the right way? And also, what's your top, if people are going to have 3 top tips that they can take away from this session, what would those 3 top tips be?
Well, I think, to your first kind of question about the practical steps that employers should be taking, I guess just pulling together everything we've been talking about so far really is think about this well in advance. Don't try and make these kinds of policies on the hoof, because you will store up problems for yourself with employees feeling like they're being treated inconsistently, grievances coming in saying that person got to do it and I didn't. So you really need to sit down and think about your organisation's policy position on all of this in advance, and think about why, so that if you get challenges or people feel it's unfair, you can be transparent and explain to them why you've landed in that position. And then once you've got your policy, communicate it to everyone so everyone understands, that there's a kind of level playing field and fairness. Now, of course, employment law being employment law, you then have the additional burden of having to consider some requests on a case-by-case basis. For example, if it's a request from someone who has a disability and that's why they need to work in a particular way, perhaps from home or from a particular location for a time. And that's where there might be other obligations, legal obligations, for example, under the Equality Act, to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people. So it's not quite as simple as just putting a policy in place and then saying one size fits all. But broadly speaking, if you've done that thinking in advance, you're really on the right track. Then, you know, kind of dealing with requests as and when they arise. So I think my top tips, just exactly that first one, communicate your policy and approach as soon as possible, and then just implement it as consistently as possible, taking into account any individual considerations. Tip number 2, consider trial periods if employees are asking for something quite new and different. Don't just go and say yes and then have to try and backtrack and get all kinds of, as I say, grievances, breach of contract type claims. And then tip number 3, thinking also about we haven't really talked about health and safety legal obligations, but if people are working from home, you still have an employer's duty to make sure they have a safe place of work. So don't ignore that as well.
Cool. Thank you, Carla. Ross, same to you. Thinking practically about this topic, what the organisation needs to bear in mind, and those, you know, the 3 top tips, the top of their list of things to really think about before they embrace this.
Sure. So, I mean, from a practical perspective, financially, it's important to make sure that you really look at both the short and long-term costs of remote working and think about, you know, the costs of any advice that you might need. You know, we mentioned on the overseas workers, that can be a significant burden. And you know, actually, this is one of the things that the Office for Tax Simplification asked about in their report. And they did find that, yes, it's a massive disincentive for a lot of small and medium-sized organisations in terms of allowing workers to work overseas, and that it was only really very large organisations that were willing to pay and bear that cost. Just to repeat a little bit in terms of what Carla said, make sure we have that policy agreed in advance in terms of what's payable, what isn't, and having clear documentation around what you have agreed with employees about where they work and on what days even. You know, that's in terms of driving the sort of tax treatment on expenses. It's really important to make sure that things are very well documented. If they aren't, then generally you're going to end up with the worst situation in terms of stuff being taxable, which potentially isn't good for you as an organisation. You might have to pay employers national insurance, and for your employee, that means more tax for them. And then thinking about, you know, if expenses are taxable, you know, do you have the systems in place to deal with that? You know, is your payroll reporting system doing that, whether or not you do it yourself or whether or not you use a bureau? And are you capturing enough information around expenses in order to be able to make those decisions around whether or not something is taxable or not, and thus whether or not you need to include it? So I think in terms of top tips, my 3 top tips, yeah, make sure you plan ahead for changes. You know, particularly around some of the expenses, you know, those compliance and reporting requirements, they can feel very onerous. But if you plan ahead and agree certain things with HMRC in advance, then actually the reporting might be simpler and the cost might be easier. And you might not have to do as much explaining to your employees about the impact on the tax side. So making sure that you get in there early, you know, particularly before the tax year starts. So very relevant now if we're coming up towards up towards the start of the tax year. You know, if you get things agreed in advance, it can be simpler. Second top tip, I've talked a lot about tax and the financial consequences, but it is important to remember that is just a factor, and you do need to consider the wider impact. People are sometimes scared of paying taxable benefits. You know, that it is okay. You are allowed to pay a benefit that bears tax. You just need to make sure that you are aware of that, aware of the cost, and aware of the compliance reporting that goes around it. And then finally, yes, if you are looking at people working overseas, make sure you get that local advice, but also do consider the UK impact as well. You know, something might be good for employment purposes, but bad for another reason. So a very common example of this that we've seen with some of the organisations we work with is that they've had employees, they've gone overseas and they've just made them a contractor. to say, oh, they're just a contractor now, it's nice and simple. And maybe for employment law, that's the case, although Carla may disagree with me. But that can have consequences for things like VAT. Actually, if you're VAT registered, suddenly now you might have to account for reverse charge, and that's an additional 20% cost that you might not have been expecting. So it is important to make sure that you consider all the different consequences of taking a particular action.
Thank you, Ross. Comprehensive as ever. Paul, the last word to yourself. I mean, the genie is out of the bottle. The technology has let the genie out of the bottle in terms of hybrid working, remote working. This is not a topic that is going to go away. Organisations have to think about this topic and take practical steps to consider it. Again, your thoughts on, your advice to what organisations can practically do to embrace it, and what those top tips from you would be.
Yeah, of course. So I think here and now we're talking about it as being remote working and hybrid working and so on. I think increasingly people will just think of it as working. So actually working on the assumption that this is how people will increasingly be working in the future, to ensure that an organisation has the right infrastructure, strategy, applications, support arrangements, etc. in place to embrace that. So practically speaking, it may mean things like reviewing support contracts or even staffing to make sure there's support around if people are flexibly working. Making sure that the right kind of security is in place, of course. So things like mobile device management, device encryption, even intrusion detection and looking for unusual patterns of access, perhaps. Thinking about whether people have the right kit at home, making sure that, I mean, this goes beyond just technology, but even things like, the right desk space and, complying with, rules about display screen equipment, that they're not sort of, working on the sofa with a laptop balanced on their knee, but actually, they've got a proper size screen and a proper size keyboard and mouse, and, they're doing that in a way that's safe, assuming they're working in a fixed location, of course. If they're out and about, moving around, making sure that, again, they've got the right equipment, they're not lugging around a great big heavy laptop when actually something a bit lighter would work better for them, and so on. Yeah, and then in terms of tips, I mean, if there were three that we'd give, just, I mean, there's so many really, but if we had to whittle it down to three, I'd say probably first one would be ensuring that an organisation has control over where its data is held. So that might involve making sure that devices are encrypted or can be managed remotely, or that you've got rules in place about where data can be accessed from and how it can be downloaded and so on. So protecting the organisation's information assets from that technology perspective. Second one would be making sure that the support arrangements are good, and that they support the new ways of working within the organisation, and that staff have the right kit. They're not using the kid's 10-year-old PC riddled with malware and viruses, to log on and get, the payroll done or something. So making sure that, they've got the tools that they need. And I think probably the other one would be something around actually being aware that kind of thing might happen if it isn't controlled. So actually having the right policies, controls, processes in place to try and keep a grip on some of that. I mean, obviously the technology can only do so much, but there are some amazing tools out there that can make managing all of this a lot easier. So yeah, so we'd recommend looking at that.
Cool. Thank you, Paul. As I said, the genie is out of the bottle. Remote working is here to stay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panel, to Carla from Russell-Cooke, to Ross from Sayer Vincent, to Paul from Adapta. Thank you to everybody for watching and joining us. And please do watch out for further similar events, sessions from Russell-Cooke, Sayer Vincent and Adapta over the next few months on similar topics where we all have an interest in those matters. And on that word, we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.